Hi everyone. I want to thank Annie Fukushima and Kim Koronek from the University of Utah, as well as the Utah Film Center, for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event highlighting the film Call Me Gonda. This is a film about a murder. The murder of a woman, the murder of a trans woman, the murder of a people, and the murder of a nation. And as such, it sheds light on a myriad of interconnecting issues such as gender violence, trans and homophobia, colonialism, militarism, racism, and ultimately the issues of sovereignty and imperialism. That's a long list, and it can seem overwhelming, but we can look at them and we can take the issues from the Philippines and apply them to our broader world and to the past as well as the present. The Philippines has been a colony and then a neo-colony for over 500 years, first under Spain and now under the United States. And as the film clearly shows, the Philippines is a client state of the US. And as such, aside from the economic ramifications, it has been used as a military site and strategic point. First, you can look at it in terms of the Korean and Vietnam wars, and today it's especially strategic given the now emphasis on the containment of China. Like elsewhere in the world, the military brings violence against women. This is historic. We've all heard the words rape and pillage. Well, there are no castles anymore, but still the rape and pillage and destruction of communities and nations such as the Philippines, Syria, and Iraq are there for us to see. And with them comes violence against women and, yes, rape. And we all know that the greatest casualties of war, the greatest victims, are women and children. The reality is, it's still assumed that soldiers need sex. And it's also assumed that the women and some men of occupied nations are there to provide it for them. And like many people in places in the world, the Philippines has a long history of militaries using the women for what's euphemistically called sexually servicing them. In fact, there's documentation going back to the early part of the 20th century that talks about the presence of prostituted women around military sites. And we can see this up until the present day, as the film clearly shows. The reality is that Philippine women have always been viewed as commodities. And today, whether as domestic workers shipped all over the world or being sex trafficked either internally or externally. In Call Me Gonda, Jennifer Loudy calls this survival sex. I think this is a really good term because it obviates the whole question of good or bad, and in fact even deals with a very misused word called choice. Sometimes choice is consensual, but more often than not, it is not. During World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army from 1932 to 1945 created and institutionalized a system of sexual slavery that enslaved hundreds of thousands of women from all over the countries occupied by Japan. And they installed them as, quote, comfort women. And these women, ranging from very young ages to their early 20s, were forced to be raped every single day, sometimes as many as 25 to 40 men a day. Obviously, most of these women did not survive. But for those who did, it was a well-kept secret, an open secret, but it was never spoken of publicly. In 1991, 50 years later, a brave woman named Haksun Kim came forward and broke the silence. When she did that, hundreds of women from all over Asia followed her example, including women from the Philippines who were called Lolas, grandmas. Their basic demand is an apology, an official apology from Japan. Unfortunately, Japan continues its denialism and refuses to offer this apology. So, why is this important, and what's its connection to the film? When the Comfort Women survivors spoke out, they helped change the narrative. Unfortunately, rape during war, although outlawed for hundreds of years, was considered normal. And when the Comfort Women spoke out, they helped, along with other women, like from the former Yugoslavia, to change that. And now, rape as a strategy of war is considered a crime against humanity and a war crime. By breaking the silence, these women were also breaking the cycle of shame, because unfortunately, when women get raped, we are blamed. And in some ways, they were the grandmothers of the Me Too movement. They spoke out, and their numbers let other women speak out. And their legacy can be seen in the testimony of Yazidi women in Iraqi Kurdistan, or in the great movements against femicide that are emerging in Latin America. Call Me Gonda is the story of a murder, but it's also the story of how to change perception and how to stretch the notion of what is gender. We're really living in an amazing moment where who and what we are, our very identities, are being expanded. And this, we know, is because of the trans movement and the LGBTQ movement. And we know that these movements were part and parcel of people coming out and being brave and changing society. And that also changed, for many people, not all, the way that their families looked at them. Because when their families had people in them who were gay, who were queer, they had to deal with it. Some did, some didn't. But the love and acceptance that people felt helped change society. And we can clearly see this in the love and acceptance that Jennifer Loudy's family felt towards her. And I believe this is what actually was the basis for their determination for her to get justice. This film is also finally a story of commitment and resistance. Just as Haksun Kim's testimony came out because she was able to be supported by the then vibrant Asian women's movement, so too Jennifer Loudy's family was able to actually go up against both the American and Philippine governments because they were supported by a vibrant people's movement in the Philippines. And this movement included queer people, trans people, the women's movement, and an anti-colonial movement. And it really is a testament to this movement's character that they took this on at a time when maybe everybody didn't agree that this was an issue or didn't understand the relationship between sovereignty and the murder of a trans woman. So I think this is also an incredible thing that the film really shows. I think Call Me Gonda calls on us to keep fighting and not to give up. I mean, there wasn't total victory in this film, and there isn't total victory, we're a long way from it, in the world. There's still an epidemic of gender violence, there's transphobia, there's racism, homophobia, and yet we can still see the glimmers of change ahead of us. You know, the Comfort Women, who are all in their late 80s and 90s, continue to struggle. In fact, the Lolas were part of the Justice for Jennifer movement. And they did it because they don't want what happened to them to happen to anyone else. And Jennifer's mother, Nai, said the same. We struggle not just for Jennifer, but because if we don't, another murder is just waiting to happen. In the beginning, I named a bunch of interconnecting issues, the ones that keep the system going. Naming them allows us to look at our own country and our own history. What is the relationship of gender colonial violence to our history? What impact has internal militarization had on people of color? What is the history of enslavement and genocide? We can look at all these things and take the lessons from this film. So how do we make these connections? How do we both challenge ourselves, our assumptions, and really build change? How do we focus both domestically and internationally at the same time? I think when we see the pictures of masses of people fighting for Jennifer, or when we understand that a transnational movement is continuing to build support for the comfort women, we can see just two examples of people fighting for themselves, but also for others. And this is what creates change, and ultimately, this is what builds a real transformation. And I think this is the ultimate lesson and the ultimate takeaway that we can get from this film. I want to thank again the people who made this film possible, and I want to thank you for listening. Good night.